And that's what Deleuze-Guattari also say, that this kind of temporary deterritorizations might kind of lead to new reterritorizations, new patterns, and maybe it's also, but it's what is rare is that kind of rigid, stereotypical organism. And particular things might be different during the weeks, from the weekends, in terms of the audiences and how they reassociate things. Well, the assemblage is something which is far less to pinpoint, as you said. You can always say this is this organism, and you have it. You can define it, and you know what belongs to it and what doesn't. An assemblage is precisely a strange concept because you can't say exactly this is the assemblage. If you try to do that too much, you pretend it is an organism. You can help yourself saying temporarily, for some observers, these things function together like this. And that's why this constellation, I called it an assemblage for these people. So and once it is an assemblage for these people, it's a kind of temporary organism for these people. So then the distinction collapses. So it's a bit peculiar, difficult to talk about it. Why? Because our whole grammar and speech and logic of thinking is geared to these kind of types and stereotypes and organisms. That's what, and it's difficult to. So I agree with you that it's far less easy to define or pin down an assemblage. You shouldn't even count by one. You shouldn't say the assemblage. That's the problem. So you could say but the grammar doesn't allow you to express that vagueness. You can say assemblage like constellation potential. So, and then something like this, or the virtual. In Deleuze-Guattari, they do also these phrases like virtuality and actuality. They help. These might help. So there is a kind of in an assemblage, which is something kind of a cloud of potential, or something virtual, which come to life only temporarily in the eyes of particular users in certain interactions, which is not only it might be just a singular evening or something where these things have interacted in a certain way, and if it becomes a very regular occurrence, it is more organism-like, but it still isn't if there is other regular occurrences with other audiences reassociating the pieces in very different ways. I would still use the phrase assemblage. Yep.
When I hear what you're talking about is that it's not only the desire and ambition as an architect, but you probably have some belief that the society actually moving towards more ambiguous, fluid, and less rigid and fixed, and therefore, like organism assembly might work in certain society, but might not work in other society. And Deleuze-Guattari was very popular in Japan, and it was well accepted because like Japanese society has got a more temporality structure, and even in architecture, we believe the architecture doesn't, last forever. Continuously redesigned or transformed or evolved, in very short term. And well, I want to know, do you think this kind of approach could be accepted in the Western world, which, from my point of view, is more rigid and fixed, for a long period of time?
No, I agree with. First of all, I agree with you that this is not some kind of desire on the architect's part, which comes from nowhere. We should have this desire because society becomes like this and requires these kind of spaces. It is matching up more with what I call post-Fordist network society. So that's why, although you might develop that desire without thinking about social realities, just being inspired, just finding it interesting and playful and stimulating, and you're a very intuitive person, but I think that some of us who are thinking more seriously about the overall trajectory and development of architecture as a discipline and its categories, for us it's important to say, yes, these categories are pertinent with respect to contemporary society. And we should upgrade, we can no longer think in terms of these rigid types, and we need, for instance, we need to embrace complexity, ambiguity, dynamism of reconfiguration, reassociation, and therefore that becomes also the argument we can place against something like minimalism, a style and a set of principles which cannot cater for that and rejects that. The argument is not that simply they like this, we like that. They're anachronistic and capable of registering and catering for contemporary social trends which are very powerful and productive. So it becomes an argument about this historical necessity or superiority of one conception about architecture and its design strategies versus another one which is defunct or outmoded. So that's very important.
Would the distinction between assemblage and organism apply to forms of communication? And if yes, is internet an assemblage?
Yes, I think so. I think it would. I mean, then there's another distinction which Deleuze and theory offer, which are very similar, which is the rhizome versus the hierarchical tree structure, for instance. And it also applies to it. There's a kind of open network structure where there is rhizomatic and assemblage-like properties. I mean, but there's also this idea of territorialization happening, where there's a crystallization of certain routines, certain expectation. So what a website is becomes nearly like a kind of expected stereotype as well. So that also, it is not necessarily denies, you know, we have to also recognize the usefulness of some of these routines and expectations to crystallize. But there's new things coming along. So they're not going to be there for 100 years, you know, the website is. And for instance, then there was this there's Web 2.0 now, where there's a lot of new things which you didn't have in 1.0, in terms of comments lists and so on. But they have become now standard as well. So to some extent, there is kind of a re-territorialization of the web as well. But as a totality, it's still kind of rhizomatic, assemblage-like. And yes, let's say if you say, does it apply to forms of communication? Yes, that's what I said earlier. It applies to human institutions, to or also social organizations, which are in a sense constellations for communication. So what a firm is, a corporation was in the modernist era very rigid. It was very clear who was inside and who was outside. That to still extent is still clear, but less so. The contemporary organization is a kind of network organization, which might have strategic alliances with others, might have, you know, a lot of consultants coming in. We have, of course, we still have a distinction between employee and consultant, so it's not totally open. But there are some network organizations which don't have much of this distinction, where everybody is self-employed, for instance, or re-employing here. And unfortunately, it's also the legal framework is preventing some of that fluidity, which really would want to happen. Right? For instance, we're not allowed. You know, freelancing is kind of prevented to some extent, right? Kind of excessive freelancing. But with small firms, that's very much the case. So that would mean, for instance, if you freelance in several companies, that the clarity of who belongs to which organization is lost, and that's also what is internal, what is external, that gets blurred. Institutions become communication situations become more blurred, whether something is a business meeting or formal or informal talk. There's so many potential situations emerging that there is very stereotypical situations are less prevalent. You have to be more individually define the situation when you gather. It's not so much always totally pre-formed. Of course, there are models and types of institutional models you rely on. This is a seminar and so on. But I mean, it's something strange. It's not 100% a seminar because in the company, it's the exterior students, current students, staff. I wouldn't even mind if somebody else comes in who has nothing to do with you. Yeah.
So doesn't that mean impossibility of differentiation? That there is.
Well,
so
no, it is still differentiation, but it's temporary differentiation.
How can we, if you define it as a temporary, is already something that's not like
no, it's just less. It's less. I think it's a good point. I mean, all both assemblage and organism are differentiated structures, right? They have their
the exactly meaning of differentiation gets really blurred.
It's still temporary for certain, and it's also elements have roles. So as at the guerrilla army, there's a temporary leadership because they've gotten into the swamp and there's somebody who knows this kind of thing and is stronger. He takes up leadership and commands, and now in the new situation allocates, the cook is now becoming the fish catcher or something.
Yeah,
there's a differentiation there as well, a division of labor there as well. But it's not forming, it not follows a predefined stereotypical diagram, and it's temporary. It's like contemporary family situations. That gets a bit of blurred. It's no longer true that you could only have one mother. You could have the real, how do you call it, the real inverted commas mother, the stepmother, and the girlfriend of your father. And I mean, it becomes very kind of. It doesn't mean that it isn't differentiated. I think both the organism and the assemblage are differentiated structures, but they are differentiated now temporarily and with multiple roles of the elements and multiple subdivisions within it, which is like your overlap. So that an individual in a social organization can be part of several groups simultaneously, and in each of these groups maybe have a quite different role, and that is simultaneously happening. So it's a differentiation. Let's say it's more complex. The diagram is more complex. It allows overlap. It allows blurring of boundaries. Not that you either in part of, for instance, you're part of the resource committee. You could say, if we had formalized it and written it down somewhere, who's belonging, we don't. We have a resource committee, but it's kind of associates are regularly coming, more or less regularly. Somebody pops in only here and now. So there's a more or less of belonging to the resource committee, right? So it's that is fuzzy logic. So it's not you in or out the set. You more or less in it, more intensely. It's evolving. You're at the same time in several other places, more or less. And some of these groups might also fuse. For instance, the resource committee, which sometimes work on the same day with the acquisition committee, and sometimes these things kind of blur and fuse into one. So they're de-differentiated, but then the next time they might be re-differentiated, or they're just differentiated in time. This kind of one flows into the other. So the description becomes more complex. But I think it is maybe in the end, it's difficult to say is that what is more or less differentiated. Maybe it's more differentiated because with the same number of people, we can talk longer and say more about the different roles, purposes, belongings. There's more to say. So let's say you have 400 company of 400 people here, and then we have a Fordist modernist of 400 people. There's a strict division of labor and differentiation, territorialization, domains of competency, and here we have that we have multiple belongings with degrees, with overlap, with fusion. So this is much more complex and you could say higher forms of higher organized than this organism. So it's still to some extent it's kind of an upward superiority in a higher evolved kind of entity where the story is more complex per number of persons, for instance, involved. And the same would be the description for an assemblage designed house. On the same amount of square meter, you can do much more. So it's more nuanced, more pertinent, more it's just more complex, more rich, and also more productive. That's the point anyway. It's more productive. You get more value per square meter. I'm not saying monetary value. Just more human value, more prosperity, more purpose, more effectiveness. If you work this way, like we think we're getting more effectiveness out of 400 people in a contemporary organization, then and our building, well, we have this crappy premises, but if we would design our own building, we would design something much more sophisticated than a design for a kind of rigid corporate organization from the 1950s, which is, by the way, another important kind of comparison which has fueled this kind of debate, because Deleuze and Guattari, when they talk about this concept of the rhizome, the assemblage, deterritorialization, smooth versus triad space, all these categories, in a sense, they also could, because they're very abstract philosophical categories, they also apply very much to what happened to organization theory, to corporate, to working life, moving out of rigid hierarchy, contained organism-like social organisms of corporate America, let's say, or Europe, into a world of network organizations, clusters, flat hierarchies, self-organization, blah, 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 blah. All these, that is also the kind of Deleuze and Guattari philosophy gives the vocabulary to understand this distinction, describe that new social world. So, and that's quite makes this very meaningful.
1:30.
This will be the next lecture seminar. So anyway, this lecture should be informal, so we can. Any more questions? Can discuss a little more. Yeah.
Just about the new typology in the modern architecture. Is it possible to see the difference between assemblage and organism? This kind of architecture, like an evolutionary process from the toward mutation from the original. Just an example, from a cinema to a multiplex, we have a kind of successful mutation because the organic mechanism remains the same, but in a kind of complex.
Well, I think whenever you can name something so determined like a multiplex, it has evolved into a new organism to some extent, right? There's an institution, there's certain things you expect. You expect choice of movies, there's a minimum amount of, it's not absolutely fixed, it's not 15, but it's somewhere between 10 and 20, whatever. And you expect, the popcorn and the lounge, and so these things kind of, although it has evolved from something which was a standalone cinema into a multiplex, I don't know when these occurs, there were in-betweens. So yes, in the in-between there was moments of deterritorialization, of uncertainty, of fluidity, of potential. It's maybe in assemblage, I don't know, if a certain bar and coffee shop suddenly appeared between the cinemas. That seems kind of unexpected initially. and later on becomes kind of routinized, because also what you then your evening, the way you expect and run through your evening becomes, and it's still particular. It's an organism because I think, I'm not sure if I'm right, but usually there's people, this bar, whatever there is, sometimes in the multiplex, is only frequented by those people who sit before or after the movie there. And it's not something totally interlocking and overlapping, so it's something which is an evolving organism maybe, yeah?
Can we say something about it? From this point of view, assemblage can also open up to future possible organisms.
Yeah.
If you recall also what you were saying before about the car, actually I was about to ask you the same point. In the beginning the car was completely an assemblage. Because it was part of the car supposed to be driven by the horses.
Yeah.
And so we can say that in a first step, an assemblage could be also a creative moment which open up to possible development in terms of new possible organisms. Like the things that Marco was saying, like in the beginning, when cinemas were not working anymore from a functional economical point of view, we started up mixing the cards again and assemblaging. Something that was not existing at that point, because for example, the first big like mall starts to have cinemas. It was a pure assemblage.
I mean, actually, I absolutely agree with you, and to some extent, all major inventions start like this. The tinkering, and when you look at the Steve Jobs movie, the kind of combination of a keyboard with a TV set was that kind of epiphany of creating something totally new out of it, bringing together formerly distinct and unrelated elements into a new synthesis.
Right.
And so on. So
the first PC, first computers.
Yeah, personal computers. Yeah. So there's nearly always that moment and of tinkering, and then you draw things together, and then later on oftentimes you routinize and optimize, and then you adapt the pieces which originally come from other contexts. They're now, and they had some capacity in a new context, good enough to see a new potential or to do some new work, and then you re-evolve them and make them more specific for that new work. Now what I'm talking about when we set the design project, for instance, here at the moment, is to not just invent something new and evolve it into a new organism where the pieces are now perfectly adapted for that new role, but leave elements in latency so that they shift between multiple scenarios which are operating at the same time. And when you're talking about the car, when the car comes into the house, it fuses with the furniture of the living room, for instance, and its audio system suddenly, plays in different ways, and maybe it dissociates even some segments, like the chair pulls away and replugs in and so on. So that's the idea there. I mean, the particular with the car, but also we also integrating a boat, for instance, but it would also be it is playing multiple scenarios where each element in space has multiple lives simultaneously or in time change. So we're moving to a situation where rather than fusing now the keyboard with the TV, there is the kind of the keyboard can pull away from the computer again to do something else and become a typewriter, and the TV is still a TV or something else. That would be the kind of scenario. Then the last point I want to make here is the designer task is now this, and I will come to that as maybe the second half next time. That is not only one of arranging the technical and social functionality in terms of the possibility of creating these events, but to articulate these multiple belongings at the same time. So you create this kind of chameleon So visually and aesthetically, you indicate, you manage to offer multiple affiliation and multiple belonging, multiple unities which are becoming perceptually integral this way and in another time that way as flipped images. So I'm marrying the kind of idea of the assemblage with the phenomenology of perception flipped images. And that is particular designerly task of giving form, shape, selecting shape, form, texture, color, to create these, to make the potential units of interactions which kind of overlap in a certain segment, simultaneously legible, or legible from one view and another one from the other, or through modulation of light, or just through modulation of looking at it again. So that's another topic where I want to, where it becomes very designerly, not only in an organization and programming sense, but in a kind of aesthetic sense.
Well, that makes me think a lot of the house from the movement, the style. Schroeder house.
House Schroeder, yeah.
Schroeder house, yeah.
Yeah.
You can shift walls and move everything around to make it somehow adapt to your living. If you have two children, one child,
Yeah.
single.
That's a good example, and it's also very abstract. It's not, when it first appeared in the history of architecture, it was some unrecognizable strange kind of creature which, but it was I don't know how much the actual family really, was more of a manifesto statement.
Yeah.
So I agree it's part of the discourse.
Yeah, and I hope I don't say something horrible towards the end. I was thinking, you were asking about the examples, and for me, the architecture that we do could be placed somehow or somewhere is in between. Because sorry, I don't know your name. Well, yeah, when you were mentioning an example for something that could be an assemblage, but also an organism. And I wonder if the difference or those kind of architecture would be the assemblage that wants to become an organism, so that there is an intention, because it's not a disruption per se. Perhaps the difference is there. I was thinking in something that intends to disrupt, like the painting that you were showing, and a kind of assemblage that wants to become intentionally an organism. And somehow I see what we do as an example for that. I don't know if I'm clear.
Yeah, no, I agree. We have these kind of open compositions with we like multiple readings. We're not making it always explicit, and it's difficult. Sometimes you have clients and programs which are quite determined, and they want to know. They expect one space for one purpose. So that pushes towards organism. But of course, the way we arrange these spaces, they flow into each other, so it's clear where one thing starts and one thing stops, and there is this kind of, there are these kind of ambiguities which are make more assemblage-like. But I would, it would be nice, and I think I thought about this recently, if we, in the next iteration of our work, we need to also again question and think more on program and program intensification and programmatic invention to integrate. We will have, in a dialogue with the client, to make this work more open and more multivalent, let's say, in its reality. But these projects, I think our projects have a lot of that aspect, particularly in the public areas, Wolfsburg's under the space underneath, and there's unexpected multiple entrance into the space. So we manage there. I think the foreground, some of the programmatic inventions and challenges, cross-programming and so on, which became important in deconstructivism, should become more of an agenda for us too. I've recently, I listened to, for instance, the work of Dilys Cafidio and Renfro in a lecture, although formally they're very derivative, what I find there's some kind of challenging the expectation of programming uses of spaces in unusual ways. So I think that's something which is helpful to and prevents a little bit that closing down the project too much into an organism, because that's coming from the client often, because the client hasn't been challenged sufficiently, because oftentimes brief writing in clients and briefs, the format of a brief, which is a schedule of accommodation, is very much stereotyping and is a kind of an outmoded form of presenting a brief and labeling the spaces. In the end, the breakdown of a room book and the labeled spaces was kind of preventing what should happen. That's why I'm saying in terms of the research, instead of labeling places, we have crowd modeling. So you can kind of evolve scenarios that something is more or less for this and that, and the size of the space grows and shrinks with the crowd, and there's simultaneous happenings and so on, and the character switches as the light switches and so on. So that's the way you have something, rather than writing a bunch of labels which can only be stereotypes, can only simplify this project. I mean, and that in a sense does violence to the institution and to the architecture.
I would like to not to ask a question, but rather to say a general comment for our seminar, because it's not our first meeting. It's our first meeting, but not the last. I think since most of us are practicing architect, it would be easier to accept this concept and easier to understand them if we would deal more with some, let's say, direct, down-to-earth programmatic and functional examples from real life, also architectural examples, like really direct, because of course it's important to have indirect preferences because it helps you to keep discussion more vague and broad. But in order to really understand it and to be able to approach it somewhere else, it's very important to have several examples and we will forgive the difference.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I mean, that's the thing. But you need to bring something from one domain to another. So the next part of the seminar will be about biology and the series of categories. And yes, and then we need to. I had some architectural examples here, the Bauhaus and some historical examples and so on. And there could be more examples down the line. We had Parc de la Villette. We had. So I agree with that. In the end, we need to exercise the application of these concepts in the analysis and description of build projects, and ultimately our evolving designs. So I agree with that. It's a work which needs to be done. It's not that necessarily that I have a stock of close readings of well-known buildings. So that's something which, is something I can't put out of my head, but you can try to do that,
during the discussion.
Yeah.
But I also like to keep the discussion as abstract as possible. Because, for example, even architecture sense, no one really defines cyberspace or a digital space. It's all space, but no one really physically defines, in a contemporary architecture. So it's like this discussion could go towards what is the individual cyberspace could bring into the three-dimensional physical space.
Well, I mean,
and you can't really bring the example. This is this. In cyberspace, you have multi-layer,